This video discusses one of the most important concepts in all of economics, comparative advantage. And we're going to use the PPC that we learned about in the last video to illustrate this concept of comparative advantage. An economist named David Ricardo, who was one of the first economists, one of the fathers of the discipline, wrote about international trade between England and France about almost 200 years ago. And he argued that England should trade with France because both countries would be better off as a result. But this was counter the belief of many people who at his time thought that they shouldn't trade. If they traded with France, England would be worse off. And he illustrated that no, trade will make both parties better off. And so we're going to illustrate that now with the PPC. I also have a problem that we'll do in the next video that will also illustrate the approach that David Ricardo took to comparative advantage a little bit more clearly. Okay, so here we have one country. And in fact, they're referring to these as economies, and they're saying, imagine South America as an economy, all right? And then here is Europe, the economy of Europe. These economies only produce two things, food and computers. David Ricardo, I mentioned he was one of the first economists, also made simplifying assumptions, and he assumed that France and England only made two things, cloth and wine. So here we're going to say it's food and computers. And so in South America, if they use all their resources to produce computers, they can produce 200. If they use all their resources to produce food, they can produce 400 units of food. Maybe it's tons of food, or maybe this is numbers of computers. But we don't have to be that precise here. On the other hand, Europe, if it uses all its resources to produce computers, can produce 400. Whereas if you use all its resources to produce food, it can only produce 200. So let's say that these countries do not trade with each other. These economies do not trade with each other. But they want both computers and food. So South America decides to produce at point B, and Europe produces at point E. So my question is, first of all, what is the total world production of computers? 300. 100 from South America and 200 from Europe. So there are 300 computers being produced in the world. What is total world production of food? Also 300, because there's 200 from South America, 100 from Europe. But now these countries, these economies, decide to trade with each other. And I know that sometimes we refer to it as economies deciding, or countries deciding to trade. In fact, that's not the way the world works, right? Governments pass laws that restrict trade. Governments are made up of people. So we do know that governments pass, tariffs on imports and restrict trade, and then they decide to take those trade barriers away. So let's say that the governments of these countries, let's be more accurate and say the governments of these countries remove trade restrictions. We can do better than having 300 computers and 300 tons of food. How can we do better? Well, the countries can specialize in the production of the good in which they have a comparative advantage. That means they use all their resources to produce that one good. And then they trade with the other country. And we'll see that that makes them both better off. So you have, or a country has, a comparative advantage in something if its opportunity cost is lower. So what is the opportunity cost of making food in South America? What's the slope of this line? 1/2. And so you could think about it this way, as I illustrated in the last video. The opportunity cost of making 400 units of food is 200 computers. So therefore, the opportunity cost of making 1 unit of food is 1/2 a computer. What's the opportunity cost of food production here? 2. The opportunity cost of making 200 units of food is 400 computers. So therefore, the opportunity cost of 1 unit of food is 2 computers. So Europe has a higher opportunity cost of producing food than South America. In other words, South America has a comparative advantage in producing food because its opportunity cost is lower. South America has a comparative advantage in producing food, it must be the case that Europe has a comparative advantage in producing computers. Because it is impossible to have a comparative advantage in everything. You can be better at everything, but you cannot have a comparative advantage in everything. That's a key insight. Everybody has a comparative advantage in something. Sometimes, well, okay, let me leave it there for now. Okay, so South America is going to produce food. Europe's going to produce computers. What is now total world production of food? 400. And total world production of computers? 400, right? Because South America is going to produce here at point C. Europe's going to produce here at point D. We're going to go from getting, before trade, 300 of each of the goods to 400 of each of the goods. So now there's a question of how do we divide these up, right? They have to trade, and that's a negotiation. That's outside the model. But assume they just trade one for one. So South America produces 400 units of food, sends 200 units of food to Europe, and in return, Europe sends them 200 computers. So South America would be at this point here. On the other hand, Europe will produce 400 computers and so Europe will produce here at point D. It will send 200 computers to South America, and then South America will ship 200 units of food to Europe, and so Europe can consume at a point like point G. Notice this is beyond their production possibilities curve. With trade, economies can consume more than they are able to produce themselves. That's a key insight of David Ricardo. And likewise, I showed you a moment ago, South America would produce here at point C, send 200 units of food to Europe, and then Europe would send it 200 computers, and so it would be here at point D prime. All right? We can also illustrate this by combining the PPCs to make a world production possibility curve. That's what we're doing here. So this portion is South America's PPC, and this portion is Europe's PPC. So before trade we were here at 300, but after trade we can have a world PPC. So that might help you conceptualize it better. If not, I usually think about it by looking at the countries individually and showing how they can move beyond their PPC. Yeah?
This is something that they did identical to what they did after one of the world wars for Europe, when they divided up each country specialized in one. I believe Germany was like for lenses and things like that. Each product.
So that's a good question. Was there some organization or entity that decided you should specialize in something?
Yeah.
In fact, in market economies, it doesn't work like that. Remember last lecture, in lecture 3, we talked about the different types of economic systems. So in a market capitalist system, individuals decide what to produce. They maximize profit, and they decide what they produce. And so it so happens that in those economies, they end up producing whatever it is they have a comparative advantage in. But in a command socialist economy, there the government or someone else will decide who produces what. And hopefully they correctly decide to produce whatever they have a comparative advantage in, but not always. Right? Sometimes in command socialist economies, because there's a lack of a profit motive, those in charge do not select the most efficient things to produce. In other words, they don't produce the things in which they have a comparative advantage in. So I'm not aware of anything like this in Europe after the war. I think that they pretty much let them, the entrepreneurs in those economies decide what they wanted to produce, and then they end up producing, like lenses and high-tech stuff in Germany, and then clothing and stuff like that in the south of Europe, like Italy. And there is a case in point article exactly about this. One more way in which we can illustrate we can use this model to illustrate something is the concept of growth. We can use the PPC to illustrate growth. So let's say we have an economy with 100 workers, 100 machines, but we develop a new technology, for example. This allows us to produce more of everything, this new technology, right? A new discovery. We can illustrate this by shifting out the PPC, like you see here. So notice we talked about two different ways to use the PPC. One, we can look at movements along the PPC, but here we have a whole new curve shifting out. And this distinction between movement and shift is going to be important when we talk about the demand and supply model next week. Economic growth tends to be a concept discussed in macroeconomic courses more than microeconomic courses, because it's a question about the economy as a whole and how it is able to produce more goods and services. You should read this section on waiting for growth. It does illustrate an important concept. Imagine we have an economy that can produce two types of goods. So imagine we have two countries. So here we have country A, and here we have country B. And they can produce consumption goods or capital goods. Same here, consumption, capital. And so here are the PPCs. Imagine that they're identical countries right now. I tried to have drawn these identically. My handwriting isn't always the best. But let's say they're identical with respect to their production possibilities, except country A produces here at point A, and country B produces here. In other words, this country is using half its resources to invest in machines and human capital, and then it's spending the other half for what? To get some utility, right? To get some pleasure. So buying some goods and services with it. This economy, on the other hand, is more patient. It's consuming fewer consumption goods, and it's investing in more capital. Today, that's happening. What's going to look different about these PPCs tomorrow or a year from now? They're going to shift out, right? Due to economic growth. And which one is going to shift out more? Country A or country B? Country B. So next year, the economies will grow. Country A will look like this, but country B will look like this. So they both grew. The PPC shifted out, but country B shifted out more because it invested more in capital. So that is a key insight in especially a macroeconomic concept of growth, but certainly it's also relevant for your own personal investment decisions, right? Like some of your high school classmates maybe aren't going to college. Maybe some of them are doing very well, but generally we see that people who go to college earn more in the future than people who don't. Okay, the last section, the last part of this section 3 talks about comparing economic systems. We did go over this already, but I'll just reiterate that, okay, so we have two types of economies, right? Market capitalist and command socialist. The model of comparative advantage that David Ricardo introduced almost 200 years ago would suggest that economies that are closer to here will be richer than economies that are closer to this end of the spectrum, right? Now, that's a hypothesis that comes from the model. We can get some data and test that hypothesis, and we did that already in a previous lecture. The data is economic freedom. This is the independent variable, and we hypothesize that more economic freedom leads to higher incomes. Income is the dependent variable. So we're hypothesizing that more freedom causes higher incomes. Is the data consistent with that relationship? Yes. Have we proven that economic freedom causes higher incomes? No. Because it could be, for example, that higher incomes actually cause more economic freedom, right? In that case, the independent and dependent variables should be switched. So we haven't proven the causal connection, but we've provided evidence for that hypothesis, and so at least we haven't rejected the hypothesis. So that's an illustration of the empirical methodology that economists use to test hypotheses. This is not a class on empirical methods, so we're going to be focusing more on theory, like the production possibilities curve, comparative advantage, and concepts like that. But I do think it's important to show you the empirical side, because many of you will find jobs analyzing data, for example. Okay, the final section here is about government. So although economists generally believe that markets are a good way to achieve efficiency in the economy, it doesn't mean that there's no role for government. We need government to make sure that pollution is not out of control, to provide policing and courts and national defense. And so few people argue that we need to have a pure market capitalist economy with absolutely no role for government. The question is, what is the appropriate balance? And that is one of the deepest questions in economics.